Perfect. And then usually, hello, welcome, welcome. We should start seeing some people. Oh, yes, I see participants. And if you are joining us, just tell us where you're from in the chat. We are really excited to be here today, and I'm going to share with you a few things to get us started. I am Chastity. I am from Pro Writing Aid, and this is our Science Fiction Writers Week 2023. And so we'll be starting the session, and I'm going to share a few things with you today. If you've joined us so far, you kind of know the drill already, but I'll walk it through in case it's your first one. So we will have all the replays, and they are added in that hub. And as soon as just everything processes, we add them in as quickly as possible for you. And you have availability to the replays until I believe it's September 28th. And then after that, it's only available to our Academy members, but you do have access to all the replays until September 28th. You have an offer, which is super exciting for Pro Writing, for 40% off one of the yearly Pro Writing Aid premium license. And so with our premium license, you get unlimited. Well, you get to unlock premium tools, which include our suggestions, author comparisons, full integrations, and just ways that you can add it in describe in a word and lots of other things. You can get in-depth genre-specific reports on unlimited word count. So that is the difference between the free and the premium. If you're on our free version, you have access to all the features and integrations as well. It's just going to be a word limit of 500. So unlocking the premium just makes it sure that you don't have an unlimited you have unlimited word count. You can curate your experience with your snippets, dictionaries, and just custom things that you can add. The offer ends September 28th as well. And you can find out more information on the hub, and I will definitely drop the links in there for you into our chat. We want to keep talking science fiction, so we also will drop the link for our online writing community, and you use your Pro Writing Aid to log it in, but it's also on the screen there for you. But I will put it in the chat. And you can keep talking with other science writing fans and keep up with dates with our writing events. And for this session, we have our Q&A box too, because the chat gets busy. That's for you guys to comment and just kind of chat with each other. If you have specific questions for Shane today, you can drop it in to the Q&A box. And we will also put anything from Shane that he wants to share into the weekly hub, and they will be like each session, you'll see the title and you'll have all the information in that session. And so that's on the hub, but I will share the links with you there. And that's it. So we're going to get ready to get started. Thanks for joining us today, and I'm going to introduce you to our speaker. We have Shane coming from Fictionary, and we're super excited to have him here today. Let me pull up this real quick. All right, so he's the author of the Myth and Magic Urban Fantasy Thriller series, and he writes as S.W. Miller. And he writes the Better Fiction Craft Guides for Writers. He also hosts the Write Better Fiction podcast and co-hosts the Storytellers Face Off podcast. That sounds fun. He's the community and success manager at Fictionary, and he has taken too many writing courses to count at this point, and he enjoys reading as much as possible. Shane is obsessed with 5 things: writing craft, mythology, personal development, food, and martial art movies. So we're so excited to have you here, Shane, and I will let you take it away.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much. And I am super excited to be here. I see some familiar faces in the audience already. And thank you, Brandy. I know you're rooting for me. So thanks very much. I will share my screen and then we can get started. Just pop into present mode as well. Okay, you should all have the full screen view of the presentation. So I won't keep you waiting any longer. Today, we're here to talk about how to edit a science fiction novel. I'm super excited to present this for you. So Chastity's done most of this already, but who am I? I am an urban fantasy author and podcaster. Like Chastity said, I'm the author of the Write Better Fiction craft guides for writers, a fiction recertified story coach editor, and more recently, the community and customer success manager at Fictionary. So that's a bit about me. But if you've never heard of Fictionary, what do we do? So at Fictionary, we help authors write stories readers love through community, software, courses, and story editing services. So we have the free community for our fictionarians. I was getting confused between my community and theirs then. And we have the software, the Fictionary software, all of our courses, and Fictionary Live, which I'll talk a bit about later. And we also have our story editing services. You can hire one of our story coach editors to edit for you. And we specialize in story or developmental editing. At Fictionary, kindness is our guide, story editing is our passion, and sculpting stories that readers love is our ultimate goal. So that's a bit about us as Fictionary. So what we're going to talk about today is how to edit a science fiction novel, paying particular attention to story editing. And at Fictionary, we class editing into 3 supergroups. We have the character supergroup, we have the plot supergroup, and we have the setting supergroup as well. So these are the 3 main areas that we believe you should focus on. And in those supergroups, we break this all down into 38 Fictionary story elements. Obviously, I don't have time to go through all 38 of these with you today. So I've picked out some of the most important story elements from each of the supergroups, and we're going to go through those and look at how you can use them to best edit your science fiction novel. So in the character supergroup, obviously, we're focusing on character. This is things like point of view, the point of view goal, character arcs, internal goals for your point of view characters and your protagonist, whether your goals in each scene are related to the plot, what happens if the goal fails. I've got that on there twice for some reason, sorry about that. Impact on the point of view character, and point of view knowledge gain. So they're just some of them. So when we talk about impact on point of view character, that means how the point of view character is impacted emotionally by the scene. And then point of view knowledge gained is anything that the character learns during a scene that might be important later on in the novel. So I've picked out 3 of the most important, which we're going to cover today, which is the point of view goal, and what happens if that goal fails. Because if you have these 3 things, then you've got a skeleton structure for each scene, which will tell you whether or not the scene will be satisfying for readers. Okay, so the first thing we need to talk about is point of view. And I'm sure most of you know what a point of view character is, but the point of view character is the person telling the story. They're the person that readers experience the scene through. And when I say this, if your main character is a chef, for example, which could still happen in a science fiction setting, if they have a background as a chef before the main adventure starts, they may focus more on taste and smell than other characters would. So your character's background can directly impact what type of senses they would focus on most, for example, and that's a way for a reader to experience a scene through a specific character. 3 things that I would say to beware of with point of view. The first is head hopping. So that is where you change point of view mid-scene without giving the reader any heads up, basically. They can see the scene or experience the scene through multiple characters at once, and they're constantly hopping heads. Now, if you're writing in third-person omniscient style, you can do this effectively, but it is very hard to do. It's far easier, and the reader much more expects these days, the modern reader, to have kind of a single point of view per scene so that they know exactly whose thoughts and feelings they're experiencing. The second thing we advise to beware are unbalanced point of views. So if you have a multi-point of view story, so you're changing the point of view character or the character who's telling the story throughout your novel, you will still have a protagonist, which is the main character of your story, the person who undergoes the most change, the person who has to pursue the main story goal. Usually your protagonist will have the most number of scenes. So the best way to make sure that your point of view scenes aren't unbalanced is by giving your protagonist the most scenes. That's slightly different if you're telling a dual point of view story where you're switching between one person and another from chapter to chapter. We would expect those scenes to have an even split between the two characters. And if they don't, that's another reason that your book might be unbalanced. And the third thing to be aware of with point of view is using too many point of view characters. If a novel has, I mean, unless, you know, this is a fantasy example, but unless you're George R.R. Martin, if your novel has too many point of views, it can become confusing for the reader. And again, you can do this well. This is artistic choice, but we would only advise attempting this if you think you can do a good job. For me, this is something I would not be able to do. I find it really hard to juggle multiple points of view, so I tend to have as few point of view characters as possible. The next story element, which we think is really important, is a point of view goal. Now, this is what the point of view character wants in a scene. This is the thing they're chasing. So when Mark Watney, for example, in The Martian, is attempting to grow his own crops, his point of view goal in one of the scenes is to grow crops. And the point of view character should have one goal per scene. And the reason I say that is because we want our scenes to be really focused and have a clear focus that your reader can root for. And one way to do that really well is to have one clear goal for your point of view character in every single scene. So some things to be aware of here are unclear story goals. If your reader can't identify what your point of view character wants, or if your point of view character doesn't know what they want, the scene can become unfocused, it can lack purpose, and it can lack clarity. The point of view character must want something in every single scene, because then they have something to do and your scene serves a purpose and your reader has something to root for. And by introducing good story goals or scene goals, this will give you the opportunity to add conflict, to add obstacles, and to add stakes, which is something I'll come on to in a moment. Also, beware of having too many goals in one scene, or too many scene goals in one scene. Because again, if your protagonist or point of view character is trying to pursue too many things in the course of one scene, it can feel a little scattergun and unfocused. It's best to have that one goal per scene so that the character and the reader has a clear point of focus throughout the scene. And the other thing to beware is making story goals or scene goals far too easy. If the goal is really easy and there's no obstacle or nothing standing in their way from achieving that, then the story can become boring because it's a foregone conclusion that your character will achieve their goal. Does this mean that the point of view character can never achieve a goal in a scene? No, it doesn't. But if they are going to achieve that goal and do the thing they set out to do, it can't be an easy road for them. There has to be a lot of obstacles which create conflict and tension along the way. And the third story element I wanted to touch on in the characters supergroup is the what if goal fails story element. And this is where your stakes come from. So let's have a quick recap. So far, we've got a clear point of view character that your reader can follow. We've got a clear goal that that point of view character is pursuing. And now we come to what happens if the goal fails. And this is where your stakes come in. So the success in a point of view goal shouldn't be guaranteed. There should always be an element of doubt as to whether the point of view character is going to succeed or fail at their goal, or the possibility that they could fail. This is what creates your stakes or consequences, and this is why the reader cares. If you've done a really good job of bonding them to your point of view character, and your point of view character has a clear goal, they are going to care whether or not that point of view character succeeds or fails. So a couple of things to be aware of are having absolutely no stakes in your scene whatsoever. Having no consequences should that goal fail, because then the reader won't care whether the character fails or not. A second thing to be aware of is a lack of tension. So without stakes, without that threat of failure hanging over the protagonist or point of view character's head, there can't really be any tension or any friction in that the character is going to succeed or fail. And we'll have a little bit more on tension later because it's one of the plot elements that I've selected. And also beware of a lack of conflict. Again, if you have no real stakes, no obstacles standing in your point of view character's way, whether that's the bad guy personified, whether that's an experiment gone wrong, whether that's kind of an engine failing on a spaceship and they need to do something quickly to fix it or face certain death, that lack of conflict again makes stories drag. So it's best to have as much conflict in there as possible. And again, we'll have a bit more on conflict later because that's one of the other plot elements that I've selected. And the great thing about this point of view character, point of view goal, and what if goal fails, if you can answer all three of these questions, you know you're going to have a satisfying scene. Because in every scene, your point of view character must do something, otherwise something bad will happen. Obviously, if they fail in their goal, that something bad is going to happen. They can succeed and everything can work out and it can be a positive ending to the scene, or they can succeed, but it can be bittersweet because in order to succeed, they've had to sacrifice something else. So yes, your point of view character might have saved an oppressed alien race during a scene, but in the course of that, there have been casualties on their side. So it is a win, but it's a bittersweet win because they've lost members of their crew or whatever it happens to be. Okay, now we've covered a little bit about the character supergroup. Let's move on to the plot supergroup. And plot is basically anything to do with story structure. So a few of the fictionary elements that we look at when we look at the plot supergroup are the name of your scenes. And what we say is that if you can name a scene in 3 words or less, that will give you a really clear view of what the scene is about. And then when you look at a list of all of your scenes together, you'll be able to see at a glance what's happening in your story. Those scene names also give your scenes a lot of purpose, because you should be able to tell from a scene name what the purpose of the scene is. So it might be escape the spaceship. Well, that's purpose because your characters need to escape in order to survive. The story arc is important, and this is one of the main ones that I'm going to touch on, so I won't say too much about that now. And again, tension and conflict, I mentioned these. We'll have a look at these because they're vitally important, and it can be hard to understand the difference between tension and conflict as well. We have scene opening types and closing types. So this is things like whether you open a scene with dialogue, action, description, and those types of things. If you do too many of one thing in one go, if you're opening every single scene with dialogue, that can become repetitive for the reader, and they won't consciously think, oh, this author has used too many dialogue opening types, but they will think something feels repetitive, I'm not quite sure what, and that could be cause for them to put your book down. And then the 2 other important elements I've picked from the plot supergroup are entry and exit hooks. These are your magic weapons to get people carrying on reading your book late into the night, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, so the first important plot element that I wanted to discuss is the fictionary story arc. And a little bit of background on this. So when Christina Stanley developed the fictionary software, she looked at a lot of the popular story arcs that are out there today, like Save the Cat, The Hero's Journey, Heroine's Journey. She even went as far back as Aristotle's Poetics, because that's how dedicated she is. But what she found is that each of these story structure templates, if you will, followed this pattern. They had 5 plot points in common. So we believe that in order to structure a brilliant story, and this is whether you're a plotter, whether you plot in advance and you want to plan these scenes out before you start, or whether you're a discovery writer and you look at things like structure in the edit and you go back and build it in, that's absolutely fine too. But what we found from analysing all of those plot structures and also analysing the best-selling books in every genre, whether that be science fiction, romance, fantasy, thriller, any genre that you can think of. Most of the bestsellers follow this structure. So your inciting incident happens anywhere up to 15% of the way through your novel. And this is the thing that disrupts your protagonist's everyday world. And this is where you first introduce the central conflict of the story. Plot point 1 occurs between 20 and 30% of your novel as a rough guide. And this is where your protagonist makes the decision to engage in the central conflict of the story. In the middle of your novel, the kind of 45 to 55% mark, this is a turning point in the book where your protagonist goes from a reactive state. So between plot point 1 and the middle plot point, generally they've been reacting to things that are happening to them because they're in an unfamiliar situation. This doesn't mean that they're passive, but what it does mean is that they're not actively influencing plot events. They're just reacting to what's happening in the best way they know how. After the middle plot point, we tend to see that characters begin to behave in an active way. They will be actively influencing plot events and trying to solve their main story goal, which is to solve the central conflict of the book. At plot point 2, between the 70 and 80% mark, you have a moment where the protagonist is brought down to their lowest moment, effectively. This is usually some form of tragedy that happens that makes them question whether or not they can achieve their main story goal. So if we look at something like Star Wars, this is the point at which Obi-Wan Kenobi dies and then Luke is left alone. And because he's left alone, he doubts whether he will be able to destroy the Death Star, fight Darth Vader, whatever it happens to be. There is an element of doubt there. Usually then the protagonist will pull through that element of doubt and they will head into the climax. The reason I haven't given a specific percentage here is because the climax, generally speaking, is a sequence of scenes that occurs from the moment the protagonist goes into that climax and then all the way up to the climactic moment where they finally solve the story goal. Like they either achieve or fail to achieve the thing that they've set out to do throughout the story. So going back to Star Wars, Luke does destroy the Death Star. He succeeds in his story goal. If we look at a different genre, something like Romeo and Juliet, even in Shakespeare's day, the goal was to find love. They wanted to find love as star-crossed lovers. That didn't happen because they both died at the end. And I hope that story's been around long enough now that I'm not giving away any huge spoilers. But the climax generally happens or kicks off between the 85 and 95% mark. As I said, I didn't put that percentage there because we have to remember, unlike the other key story scenes, it is a sequence of scenes that occurs. Okay, so the next thing I want to discuss, which is one of my favorite things actually, entry and exit hooks. And I apologize, I don't know why the text on the slide is exactly the same, but entry and exit hooks are the hooks that you place at the start or end of a chapter that keeps the reader reading. So an entry hook then is the way you hook your reader into a chapter. And what do I mean by that? This is where you raise a question in the reader's mind that forces them to keep reading. So I've got an example from Slated by Terry Terry later. It's a young adult dystopian science fiction novel. And the first line of that novel is, I run. Now, instantly, because the first line is I run and then it's a paragraph break, I want to know certain things. I want to know what the protagonist is running from. I want to know why she's running. I want to know how she's found herself in a situation where she has to run from something. Now, those questions, what, why, who, when, where, those are questions that entry hooks often force us to ask ourselves. And the same is true for exit hooks. So later on, I've got an example from Stephenie Meyer's The Host, in which she says, "Welcome to Earth, Wanderer." Now, this will be taking the protagonist into a completely new situation. It's a character who's never encountered Earth before, and it's set in the future. So instantly I want to know, what is Earth going to be like in the future? Why has this character been sent to Earth? How are they going to cope being on Earth when they've never been in that environment before. So again, it's the what, how, why, where, when. It's those questions that journalists often ask in interviews. The same questions are what your reader should be thinking about when they encounter a good entry or exit hook. Okay, so tension and conflict then. This is the third element that I've picked out from the plot elements. And I've picked them out because they're so crucial. Without tension and conflict, the story doesn't progress, it doesn't move forward, and there's nothing really to keep readers engaged beyond the entry and exit hooks. So for those who struggle to determine the difference, like I did before I started taking writing seriously, tension is the threat of something bad happening. So say, for example, your main character is walking through the deserted galley of a spaceship at night, and they hear a metallic clang behind them. Now, that metallic clang could be something completely innocent and not a threat at all. But your protagonist doesn't know that at this point. Maybe they're being followed by someone, and that someone has just bumped into something metallic, giving away their position. Say then that your protagonist turns around and they see a shadowy figure behind them. You're building the tension because that person that's following them could be a threat. So that is the threat of something bad happening. Conflict is the bad thing actually happening. So if that shadowy figure turns out not to be a threat at all and they pass by and nothing happens, the tension dissipates because nothing actually happened. If, however, the person or shadowy figure following your protagonist ends up attacking them and your protagonist is forced to defend themselves, that's conflict because the bad thing is actually happening. The threat of someone following your protagonist who means them harm has actually come to pass and the conflict is happening. So there should be tension in every scene because tension places your character in potential danger, and potential danger is what makes the reader care if you've done a good job of connecting them to your protagonist. Tension should always be related to the plot. We don't want it to feel manufactured. So where you can, make that tension related to the overarching conflict of your story or one of your subplots, if you have any romantic subplots in there. And any conflict that you have should also be related to the plot as well. It's all well and good having a high action scene that's full of conflict, but if it doesn't relate to the overall plot or what the protagonist or point of view character is trying to achieve, it might feel out of place, and readers do tend to pick up on that sort of thing. And next up, we have the setting supergroup. So this is the final supergroup that we look at Fictionary. And this is things like the location that you choose to set your novel in, the date and time. If you're working on a time travel story, for example, date, time, and timelines become extremely important. I'm thinking of a TV show like DC's Legends of Tomorrow, for example, where everything they do, if they go back in time, affects something in the present. So they end up creating these anachronisms, which are things that occur outside of the usual timeline, which cause problems later on. So date and time, if you're writing a time travel story or a multiple timeline story, becomes really important. You need to be able to keep track of that. Any objects in your novel, important ones anyway, that you draw a lot of attention to, should be related to the plot, whether that is an advanced serum that your protagonist needs to procure to cure their people of a mysterious disease. If you're drawing attention to a lot of objects, then those objects should be important to the plot. The 5 senses are crucial across every genre, and I've got more about that in a moment. Emotional impact is really important of the setting specifically, and it's something that I've only just really started to think about recently. Location splits. If you split your location, usually that would necessitate a change of scene. So again, these are the things you need to keep track of. And of course, the weather can create a lot of tension or conflict as well. If you have built your alien planet and there is a climate where acid rain is a thing, you're going to need to think about how that affects people in your society and what they can do on a daily basis. If the planet lacks gravity, you're going to have to think of a way to create gravity on your planet through scientific means. So these are all the kinds of things you can think about when it comes to weather. Now, like I've said, weather can be a fantastic source of tension and conflict. Say, for example, your protagonist needs to go somewhere to do something, but they can't because the weather outside is prohibiting them from doing that. If your climate is one where there is acid rain that can eat through spacesuits or flesh or whatever it happens to be, that could stop your protagonist getting from where they need to be, and they might have to think of ingenious ways to do that using their wits, and that is something that readers will love to see. And then the emotional impact of a setting is really important as well. And when I look at emotional impact where setting is concerned, I always ask myself the question, does the setting I've chosen give me the opportunity to create an emotional impact on the point of view character? So this example is from a different genre, but Angela Ackerman came into the fictionary community to give a talk on the emotion thesaurus. And if anyone hasn't heard of Angela, I highly recommend checking out her stuff. She's great. But she gave this example. Say your protagonist is waiting for the results of a fertility test because them and their partner have been trying to have children for a long time. You could have that scene set anywhere. It could be in her office at work when the doctor calls with the results of a fertility test. It could be at home in the bathroom. It could be anywhere. But Angela was saying if you choose really carefully where you set your scene, that could have extra emotional impact for your point of view character. So imagine if that character who's waiting for the results of their fertility test happens to be outside a children's playground when they get the call. Whether the news is good or bad, that's going to have a real impact on the protagonist emotionally because they're surrounded by children and that's the one thing they want. So think about how you can create emotional impact through setting in your own books and whether the location that you've chosen is the best location for that event to actually happen. And my favorite thing about setting, I could talk to you about this all day. I won't because we don't have all day. But the 5 senses are what we use to create a 3D experience for our reader so that they can really appreciate, feel, and see what's going on around them. If you think about it this way, we are not only, I want to say in competition, but that's not really what I mean, but we're not only competing with other books in our genre or other print mediums. What we're competing with are streaming services like Netflix and all these things that are vying for our readers' attention. When we sit down and watch Netflix, most of this sensory stuff is done for us. The soundtrack in the background creates atmosphere and feeling. We see everything painted on the screen. So what we need to do as authors is create that same imagery in our readers' minds through our words. And to do that, we can use the 5 senses. That's obviously sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And there are a lot of different ways we can use these to bring our worlds to life for the reader, particularly when we're building science fiction worlds or fantasy worlds. We are really the heavy lifters of world building, if you like. And the 5 senses is a great way to do this. So sight has a special function in that it's usually used to introduce new settings, new characters, and things like that. So the first thing people tend to notice when they look around are the sights. So it's not uncommon for somebody to walk into a brand new part of their world and notice the things that they see. Sound can be used to great effect to create atmosphere. So if you remember my example from before, someone walking through the deserted galley of a spaceship at night and hearing a metallic clang behind them, that creates tension because they don't know if they're being followed. So you can use sound to create a real sense of atmosphere. And then smell. Now, the really interesting thing about our sense of smell is it's linked to our olfactory, obviously our olfactory glands, because that's our sense of smell, but it's also linked to the sensory parts of our brain that govern memory. So if a protagonist or point of view character smells something, that could trigger a memory in them. So this is a special function of smell that if you're looking to go into a flashback or something like that, you can use the smell sense to trigger that memory or that flashback. And then you can use the same smell to bring your character back out of the flashback and into the present again. And then taste, obviously this applies to food. So if you have strange foods that you've developed for your world that we are not used to in our world, taste can be used to describe these really well. And you can also use it to think of unusual things. So the taste of emotion is one that often springs to mind. Authors will use this all the time, where a certain emotion tastes of a certain thing to a character, fear being one that we can pluck off the top of our heads really quickly. And if you're writing science fantasy, for example, I've seen the taste of magic used quite a lot. So if you have magical elements to your sci-fi world, you can also think of how magic might taste when someone casts a spell or whatever they happen to be doing. And then touch. Obviously, the special function of touch is for physical sensations and emotions. If it's really cold outside, tell the reader that by showing that the character is cold. If a reader is experiencing a specific emotion, don't just tell the reader that your character is angry. Show them by the way they feel in their body. So their heart might be beating really fast. They might clench their fists so hard their nails dig into their palms, or a whole host of other things. But we can use touch to really convey physical sensation and emotion. Okay, so I've got a few case studies that I picked out. So the first one is Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. In this novel, I'm looking at this one for point of view specifically. In this novel, the point of view character is really clear. One, because it's mostly a single point of view story, and two, because we never really head hop out of that character's point of view, and that's Wade Watts. Wade Watts is clearly the protagonist. He clearly holds the point of view for each and every scene, so you never get lost or unanchored in point of view. When I was thinking about point of view goals, my mind instantly went to The Martian, because obviously the point of view is clear because Mark Watney is on his own on Mars, and he's waiting for rescue. But his point of view goal for the whole story is to survive. It's a really clear goal. He needs to survive until he gets rescued. And then obviously he has really clear goals during each scene as well. I mentioned him trying to grow his own crops in order to survive earlier. So the fact that he's growing his own crops, or at least trying to, is directly linked to his main story goal to survive his time on Mars. And that's what I mean when I say scene goals are usually linked to the overall story goal. His goal is to survive, therefore he needs to do things in each scene that will enable him to survive. And obviously there are points at which he fails to achieve his goals. So when his crops get destroyed, for example, he no longer has a food source. He's failed to protect his crops. Readers care about that because by this point they care about Mark. The third case study that I picked was a young adult science fiction novel called Slated. And this was for an example of an entry hook. I mentioned this earlier. The entry hook is I run. And instantly I want to know why the character's running, what they're running from, and all of those things I mentioned earlier. So really think about how your entry hooks are pulling your reader into a scene. The fourth example I found, I've mentioned this already, was The Host by Stephenie Meyer. And this was a great example of an exit hook. In chapter 2, we get the line, "Welcome to Earth, Wanderer, the female voice said." Now, that last bit, the female voice said, I instantly want to know who that character is. Who is this female voice? Why are they talking to our protagonist? What do they want from our protagonist? These are all questions that come into my mind when I read that exit hook. George Orwell's 1984 was another example I stumbled upon. And obviously, this is a great example of how to include tension in sci-fi. So we've got this whole tension between Winston Smith, our protagonist, and Big Brother, who is essentially the overarching governmental control for that society. And that creates a lot of tension for society at large, but it also creates a lot of tension for our protagonist. You never really know who you can trust. You never know whether you're being watched. And those things create a huge amount of tension. And then the last example that I picked was Wool by Hugh Howey. And for conflict, this is a really great book. So obviously there's tension because it's another individual versus society story. but the conflict between individuals and society is also good. A lot of bad things happen, and the protagonist and supporting characters have to deal with those bad things. So they're the case studies that I picked out. Of course, you can go and pick up any sci-fi novel you want to and examine them for the things that I've spoken about today. Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick demo of the Fictionary software so that you can see exactly what it looks like when you're inside the software, and look at some of the things that I've spoken about today as well. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a second and switch my screen. One moment. So this is the Fictionary software, and I'll show you a few different parts because we've still got some time left, and then I want to leave some time for questions at the end. This is the evaluate page where you actually do all your editing work. So remember, it's story editing software. We're mainly focused on story editing. This novel, Evolution, was written by Christina Stanley originally for the Fictionary Certified Story Coach certification. It's a mystery with some sci-fi elements because there are some genetic modifications to dogs which affect humans and vice versa. So when you come into the Fictionary software, you can see all of your character elements, which include some of the ones that I've spoken about today. So point of view goal, for example. You can see all of your plot elements if you move over to the plot tab. Include some things that I haven't had time to mention today, like backstory, revelations. And if you do end up using the Fictionary software and you want to know what any of these things mean, you can click the little blue question mark beside the element, and it will tell you exactly what a revelation is. And if you need more information, there's also an option to expand that so that you can see a lot more about the element as well. So for example, it will tell you everything you need to know about conflict, and if you need a bit more, it will give you some more advice about how to use conflict in your novel. So that's the evaluate screen, and this is what I was talking about here, about naming your scene in 3 words or less. So if we look over on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see this kind of dark pink column that has every single scene named. And obviously this is a manuscript that has been filled in when you first go into Fictionary. Some of the elements are automatic and some you'll need to fill in yourself. But you can glance down here and see exactly what's happening in your novel, and it can be useful to label the story arc scenes as well. But one of the best things about Fictionary is that when you load your manuscript in, so you've got a first draft and you want to load it into the software, some of the visuals are done for you. So using natural language processing, and I want to be very clear here, this is not generative AI. We don't hold or store any of your manuscript data. It's just natural language processing. The software will go through your manuscript and pick out what it thinks are the major plot points in your story. So the blue line is the recommended story arc based on how many scenes you have in your novel based on word count and whereabouts those scenes should fall. And that goes back to what I was talking about, where Christina analysed all the different plot structures that are around, basically. And then the yellow line in this instance is where Fictionary thinks your main plot beats are based on its natural language processing evaluation. So you can see with this particular manuscript, for example, the inciting incident is early, but I wouldn't necessarily worry about that, because as long as it comes somewhere before the 15% mark in your novel, you've got it in the right place. And if you're writing a more fast-paced science fiction novel, perhaps with some thriller undertones, of course your inciting incident is going to occur earlier because it's more fast-paced. If you're taking time to set up your everyday world and it's a slower paced book, then yes, your inciting incident can occur up to the 15%. Where you see flat lines on the graph, like the yellow line here goes flat, that usually means there's too much space between one plot point and another, which means that the pacing will tend to drag a little. If you've ever read a book where you're thinking nothing's really happened since the inciting incident or since that big thing changed the protagonist's world, it's usually because there's not another major plot point soon enough. And then you can see these sharp spiky lines on the graph, like this one leading from plot point 1 to the midpoint. That usually means there's not enough space between the two plot points, which can mean that this section of the book will feel rushed, especially if you've had a really long gap between plot points just prior to that as well. So the aim as you edit and revise your work is to bring these plot points closer to the main story arc, because then you can be sure that you're telling a story readers will feel satisfied with. And the last thing I wanted to show you in the software is the story map. So I've spoken a few times about the structure of a scene and how it needs entry hooks and exit hooks and all of those things. You can use this story map here once you've filled out all of the elements to analyze things that work really well together. So you can simply select your story map elements using this button, turn them all off, so select none, and you can look at certain things that go well together. So we spoke in the character supergroups section about how point of view goal, and what if goal fails work well together, and it gives you a basic structure for your scene. So in scene 1 of Evolution, for example, Jazz Cooper, who is the protagonist, must get through the funeral. That's her goal, her husband's funeral. Otherwise, now in this scene, Christina has identified a weak consequence. She can't work out what the stakes are if the goal fails, if Jazz doesn't get through her husband's funeral. So this might be a spot where she'll need to go back when she revises and work out what that consequence is and how she can convey that to the reader. Whereas in scene 4, Jazz must teach a class. She's a dog trainer. Otherwise, she will lose clients. Therefore, she will lose her livelihood. She will lose the home that her and her husband built together. So that's a really clear Jazz must teach a class. Otherwise, she will lose clients, which by this point, the reader knows will have real consequences and ramifications on Jazz's life. And they're well connected to Jazz by this point. So that's something that they will care about. Obviously, you can add other elements in. So you can see whether you have a point of view and a point of view goal, but you can also see whether your scene has a good middle. In other words, whether it's got that turning point where your protagonist shifts into an active state. And you can see whether each scene has a good climax. And that's whether or not your protagonist has achieved their story goal. And if you want to, you can add in the entry and exit hooks so that you can see whether you're hooking your reader through a scene. And these kind of 6 elements, the point of view goal, entry hook, exit hook, scene middle, and scene climax, these are the things that tell you whether your scene has a good backbone of structure the whole way through. Every scene should have some turning point in the middle, just like your main manuscript does. Every scene should answer the question of whether your protagonist achieves or fails their story goal, just like your major story does. And when we look at certain novels like The Host from a science fiction perspective, and even if we look at some of Stephenie Meyer's other work like Twilight, what we found was that her scene structure is so solid that it ties perfectly into her overall story structure. The same can be said of The Hunger Games as well. The scenes are so well structured that it feeds into the overall story structure and the story flows really well. So there are a couple of the things that you can look at with the story map, which will really help you identify your story's structure. Before I move to questions, I do just want to let you all know, if I can bring my slideshow back up. Sorry for this, I love technical difficulties. I'll just bring my slideshow back up here. Okay. So today for the conference, we are offering a 20% discount off the Fictionary Storyteller software if you want to come in and see what it's all about. There is a 14-day free trial, so you don't have to sign up immediately. But if you enjoy the software in your 14-day free trial. You can sign up and get 20% off your first year by adding the coupon code PWA20 to the checkout, and you can cancel your subscription at any time as well. If you want to check that out, you can go to fictionary.co/PWA sci-fi, and that's sci-fi with a hyphen. That's fictionary.co/PWA sci-fi, and again, that's sci-fi with a hyphen. I'm sure Chastity will be sharing links and things so that you can all have access to that. And next, I will open to questions as we draw to a close and stop sharing my screen. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, or if Chastity, there were any questions in the Q&A or chat, I am happy to answer them.
Yes, we do have some questions coming up.
Right.
I don't know if you can, I don't know if you can see me, but that's okay. Let's see, from the Q&A, we'll start at the top. How can we make our sci-fi very much attractive and fascinating so that our sci-fis can easily grab the reader's attention?
Yeah, this is a really, really great question. So it comes back to what I was saying about, how I think about this now. One of my craft books, which I mentioned at the start of the presentation, is called How to Write Brilliant Beginnings. And I focused on the beginning in that craft book for the simple reason that any reader can go to one of the online stores now and they can download a sample of the book, which is about the first 10%. And that sample really should be grabbing your reader. And one of the key things that you should really focus on when you're trying to grab a reader at the start of the novel are your entry hooks, particularly into the first chapter. So do you have a strong entry hook, which is hooking that reader in where they go to look at the sample of your novel? Is your protagonist really clear at the start of the novel? And it's best to try and hook a reader in a short amount of time as possible. I know an author friend of mine only gives the sample 3 pages before they decide whether or not they're going to buy the book. So it is a really valid question, but the most important thing is to have a really strong opening line to your book, I think. Because if you don't have a really strong opening line that's hooking the reader in, there's nothing to make them read on to the next sentence, the next paragraph, or the next page. So yeah, focus on that opening line of your novel to make your book really attractive to readers. And obviously, I'm not here to talk about cover design and stuff, but make sure that you have appropriate genre covers. Have a look at the top 100 in the Amazon chart in your genre and see what those covers look like. Make sure your blurb is similar to, or product description is similar to those of your contemporaries or comp authors, and try and include a hook in your product description as well, similar to an entry hook, to try and get people to buy the book. Basically, we want to do anything with hooks that we can to tempt people to buy our books. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. And then they want to know if your slides are going to be available
Yes,
with the replay.
They will. I'll send those over, and I'll fix up a couple of the duplicate wording.
Yes. And the replays will be available for a week after this whole science fiction week. So I think that goes till September 28th. And then let's see, we have a question about being able to import from Dabble. Will it sort them into scenes and chapters based on what the way it is organized in Dabble, if you know anything about that?
Okay, well, I've never used Dabble, so I'm not quite sure how it works. When you upload into Fictionary, we accept a Word docx format file. So if there is a way for you to export from Dabble into that format and then upload to Fictionary a Word document, then yes, it will preserve everything that you've done in Dabble. So when I'm using Scrivener, or when I have used Scrivener in the past, I actually write in Fictionary now. I don't really use Scrivener anymore, but when I did, I would export a Word doc from Scrivener and then upload that to Fictionary, and it held all of the same formatting that I had in Scrivener, basically. And yes, it will, as long as you specify the scene break character that you've used. So when you've got your Word document, just make sure there's some kind of scene break character in between scenes, whether that's 3 asterisks, a pound sign, or the others escape me, but a symbol, then you can tell Fictionary that that's what you've used, and it will split your manuscripts into chapters and scenes. Yeah.
Can you use the software without internet access?
At the moment, you can't use the software without internet access. That is required, but that's always something that we're looking at going forward.
Does Fictionary support multiple languages for users?
So it supports any of the Roman-based languages. So if you want to write in Spanish, you can, all of those things. We don't support languages at the moment that use pictograms like Mandarin or Chinese or anything like that. But yes, most languages are supported, and we're looking at adding more all the time.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, does Fictionary, oh, yep, that just answers the same question. Love it. Is there a word limit that you can put into Fictionary?
No, there is not. So we don't have word limits or anything like that, because we're aware that people write across a lot of different genres. So we have some epic fantasy writers that have like 200,000 word manuscripts. We don't have any limits on word count or anything like that.
Sounds good. In the story map, does software analyze and fill in goals that are unclear, or is this manually filled in?
At the moment, it is manually filled in. And the reason we've kept some of the elements manual is because there are some circumstances where you will know your manuscript better than a language model ever could. So we're fairly confident that it can pick out your story arc scenes, but you might decide you might need to look at your goals really specifically, and therefore we've left that one for you to decide. But if you take your free trial, you'll be able to see which of the elements are automatically filled in and which of the elements you would fill in yourself. And as the software grows, we are looking at adding more automation to some of the other elements as well.
Can Fictionary software recognize multiple points of view, protagonists in a story arc, and analytical points?
Yeah, so there are ways that you can get the software to do that. My recommendation would be that if you join the 14-day free trial, you also join our free community, because every Tuesday I host Fictionary Basics sessions where I take you through really specific things that the software can do. So that would be my recommendation.
And the story map, oh yeah, we already did that one too. With the software, if it's AI, well, we don't read talks about you don't use AI in Fictionary.
Yeah, it's not generative, it's just natural language processing. So it's not like ChatGPT where your stuff is stored and uploaded and used to train models. That's not what we're doing. It's just the basic language processing tool.
PWA also doesn't store that as well.
Yeah.
If you have multiple protagonists, all with different incidents, how will this affect the story arc? Different incidents.
Yeah, so like I said, there are ways that you can get it to track multiple protagonists. So if you're writing a dual protagonist or a multiple protagonist story, think of something like, I know it's not a science fiction example, but think of something like Game of Thrones, where the protagonist becomes society eventually because there are so many points of view characters. There we have something in Fictionary called the character list, where you can add a separate character that say, let's think of something like Thelma and Louise, for example, where they are really both the protagonist. You would add Thelma and Louise as separate characters, and then you would add Thelma and Louise as one character. So you'd have Thelma, Louise, and then a separate character called Thelma and Louise. You would mark Thelma and Louise as your protagonist, and then that is what the story arc would track. So there are ways, yes, that you can get the software to track the story arc of multiple protagonists.
Does Fictionary work with screenplays?
At the moment, the main function of Fictionary is to work with full-length novels. That's really what we're targeting.
Does the interface automatically fill the storyteller?
I'm not quite sure what that question means, but like I said, there are some things in the Storyteller software that are pre-filled out, like your story arc, some of the visual insights and some of the elements, but there are some things that you would fill out yourself. So it's kind of guided, but then there are decisions that you would make as you edit.
Can we add tension in some of the scenes and not in all of the scenes?
I mean, that is artistic choice. When we coach writers and when our editors will look at manuscripts, we often find that it's best to have, even if the tension is really small. So we can think of tension as being subtle, or we can think of it as being in your face. Most best-selling novels, or novels that sell really well, have some tension in every scene, and it can be as subtle as you like, barely a mention if it's a quieter scene. But even in scenes, for example, where a protagonist is reacting to what's happened in a previous scene and they're trying to decide what type of person they're going to be or how they're going to move forward, there's still tension there because it's an emotional turmoil for the character. So that's more subtle, but there is still tension. So we would recommend there's tension in every scene, but it can be really, really subtle.
And can you share the link again for the one discount? And did you want me to share I have the one for the community. Was that one different?
That would be great. So the community is free to join, and then I'll share the link for the other one as well. Let me just grab that for you 1 second.
We got the Fictionary community one in the chat.
And I'll just grab the discount link for you too.
Thank you.
No worries. And the coupon code for this is PWA20. I'll put that in the chat as well.
Okay. And then we had a question about just being a newbie, like which subscription would you recommend if they're new and they're in the very first stages of writing fiction?
Okay, so there's a couple of things for that. So Fictionary Storyteller is we usually market it for newer writers because they have less projects on the go at once. So Fictionary Storyteller, the basic plan, gives you access to all the features, but you can store 3 manuscripts in the software at any one time, and you can archive manuscripts and bring them out, but you'll have 3 active manuscripts at any one time. Storyteller Premium is if you work on multiple projects at once, like I do, and you need 10 manuscripts stored in your software at all times. And then Story Coach is really for people who are looking to be professional editors. So if you're a writer and you have no intention of being an editor, I would say ignore Story Coach. Sorry, I'm just grabbing that link. And yeah, and then it depends on how many manuscripts you want to be working on at any one time. The one thing that I would say is when you're deciding between a monthly and an annual subscription, the annual subscription gives you access to Fictionary Live, which is essentially our live training courses, which take place year-round, taught by Fictionary certified instructors who have been through the editor's program. And we offer courses like 6 weeks to edit your novel, 6 weeks to revise your novel, 6 weeks to outline, and 6 weeks to outline a scene. So we have those rolling at all times. If you sign up with an annual subscription, you can request to be added to Fictionary Live and you'll get added in straight away.
Awesome. I'm just kind of scanning through any of these questions. I think most of them we have answered. Somebody says, how can you define modern fiction as true sci-fi?
Oh, that's a good question. How do we define modern fiction as true sci-fi? I mean, that is subjective. Anything where genre is concerned is really subjective. I have this all the time in my own genre, where there is a really blurred line at the minute between urban fantasy and paranormal romance, and what actually constitutes an urban fantasy and what actually constitutes a paranormal romance. And a lot of people have a lot of differing opinions. So I would say that one is hugely subjective.
Okay. Can we add a 6 or more sense, for example, future view, etc., in our story?
Sorry, let's repeat that again, Chastity.
They said, can they add a 6 or more sense, like adding an extra sense instead of like future view, etc.?
Oh, right. Okay. So instead of just the 5 senses, could you add 2 sense? Okay, cool. Right. So as it stands, the software only tracks the five senses. But what I found when I'm editing, because I edit a lot of sci-fi and fantasy, there will be times where I have to look at a different sense. So or an ability, let's say a psychic ability, which could be construed as a sense, whether that be telepathy or clairvoyant abilities. And in fact, in the Fictionary editors course, Christina's novel deals with an extra sense because the protagonist can see visions when she's around dogs. So I used a different story element to track that. I used the flashback element. There were no other flashbacks in the book apart from those given to the character by the visions. So as long as you're consistent and you pick a different element to track that thing and it makes sense for you, then that's a way for you to keep track of it. And that's how I did it, or how I do it when I'm looking at fantasy and sci-fi novels where characters have extra abilities. I'll pick another element that most closely matches that thing, and then I'll use that element to consistently track that thing throughout the story.
All right. Do you want to answer a few more, or we've
No,
got a lot? We're not gonna make it through all of them, but we could try to answer a
I've
few
got time for
more.
a couple more. Yeah, go for it.
Oh gosh. Okay. Does Fictionary work well with short stories?
Yes, so I have used Fictionary with short stories and novellas. Whilst our main target is novels, story structure still applies if you're writing a short story, a novelette, or a novella. And you can still track exactly the same things. It doesn't work very well for flash fiction, obviously, because that could be as short as 100 words, and there's no way really to get a story arc out of a single scene. But yes, I've used it for short stories and novellas in the past.
And I don't know if this is for Fictionary or ProWriting, it could be both, but what operating system is required?
You can use, so it's completely web-based. You can use Windows or Mac or whatever you're on to do that, to come in. But it's best on a laptop or desktop computer.
Same with ProWriting Aid. There's no app for ProWriting Aid. You can use Windows or a Mac device as well. And then, because I think there was also somebody asked if there was an app, or could you use Fictionary on a phone?
Yeah, so I mean the software is designed for laptops and desktops primarily. Some of it is glitchy on an iPad or a phone. So yeah, just if you can, stick to laptops and desktops for this.
Okay. And then somebody asked about Fictionary being used for nonfiction.
It depends what type of nonfiction you mean. So for my craft books, it wouldn't work because there's no element of story in there and it's really designed to track story. If you're writing narrative nonfiction or memoir where it needs a story-like structure, then yes. So say, for example, you'd written Elizabeth Gilbert's Eat, Pray, Love, which is like a memoir, and you wanted to analyze that within Fictionary, you could do that because it follows story structure beats. So narrative nonfiction and memoir, yes. Kind of self-help nonfiction where it's more like do this thing, no, because it doesn't have story structure.
Then let's see. This one was asked a few times. I think I lost it. Oh goodness, it was a good one. We did can you write within the software, or should you this was it, or should you wait until a novel is complete and then import?
That's entirely up to you. So if you wait until a novel is complete and then import, you're going to get the visuals automatically done for you, like the story arc and all those things. If you want to write your entire novel in Fictionary, which is what I do now, you can do that, and then you would go back and set things like the story arc scenes, and see how close it matches the blue graph. So import does things automatically. If you're writing from scratch in Fictionary, you would go back and select the story arc scenes and things like that when you're done.
All right. I think that's a good place for us to kind of wrap up. Thank you so much, Shane. You have been awesome, and this was a lot of fun. Oh, no, there I am. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this, Shane. I really enjoyed all the information, and I love the tutorial, like when somebody walks me through a software, because when you watch somebody else do it, I think it just helps. So thank you so much for sharing. And you definitely can find the replay in the hub when it's available. And then you can have it for the next week, unless you're Academy member, and then you just have it forever. So we thank you so much, Shane. We appreciate you
So
being
welcome.
here.
Great to be here.
Yes, you got lots of compliments in the chat. So you did awesome. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time.
Welcome.
Bye, guys. See y'all later.